This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, when Véronique Olmi's novella Beside the Sea was suggested as the featured text for this first workshop, I was delighted because having worked on the original French text several years ago, it gave me the chance to come back to it in a different context. It's a particularly interesting text for our purposes here, I think, in that soon after its original publication in French in 2001, it was translated into Italian, Dutch, German, Portuguese, Spanish, Danish, Hungarian and Polish. So I mean, as some of you may have actually managed to read it in some of those languages. But the English translation didn't find a UK publisher until 2010. And we can maybe talk about why that is later. The text has also taken another journey as a performance for the theatre, first in France, and Olmi is also an actress and playwright, and then most recently, and this is why it suddenly became very topical to do this text, it was performed in London on the South Bank, in March this year. The novel was a literary prize winner in France and a bestseller in both France and Germany, and it's been widely critically acclaimed, yet its subject matter means that it's also been rather controversial. The novel is one of several contemporary treatments of infanticide or child murder in France, which in fact reflect or rather engage with some high profile real life cases. And I've used that term infanticide even though the children involved in the book are not infants as such, because in France it connotes the murder of children from 1 day to 15 years old, and there's another term if they're under 1 day, if they're under 24 hours old, but there isn't another term, except they just say murder of a child under 15 is the sort of legal term. But I realised that I think this is one of our terminology things, and other different countries have different terminologies for those things. Olmi wrote her novel after reading a brief news story about a mother who killed her 2 sons after taking them to a fun fair and buying them some chips. And there was no context around that. Olmi's habitually explores limits and borders, limit situations and crises, the borders between good and evil and between responsibility and guilt. In order to draw out discussion of what we can gain, hopefully gain in this network from Olmi's text, my paper focuses on how the mother's voice and perspective is expressed in the novel, considering its various literary techniques and effects. And ultimately I'll also reflect on the place of the reader, or the space allowed for the reader, or the reader can take. First though, I'll focus briefly on the concept of maternal ambivalence. Now, Lisa spoke about this morning, and so I won't do very much, but I just sort of keep my comments to how they relate to the things that I'm going to be discussing through the text, through the Olmi's text. So the notion of maternal ambivalence relates to contradictory feelings on the part of the mother towards her children, or a mother's love for her children is expected, and it's idealised in most contemporary Western cultures to the extent that it's considered to be natural. What's less acknowledged and arguably not accommodated, because they're deeply troubling, are a mother's negative feelings, either towards her children or towards her motherhood or mothering, the way she mothers. Now, such feelings do not always lead to abuse or murder. In fact, on the whole, they don't. But in some cases, they do, as they do in Olmi's novel. Many commentators insist that maternal ambivalence is normal, such as Rosika Parker's influential study Torn in Two, experience of maternal ambivalence that Lisa talked about this morning, which was first published in 1995, and which takes a Kleinian psychoanalytical approach. So Parker argues that maternal ambivalence is due partly to the, and this is a quote from her, disjunctions between the lived experience of mothering and the sometimes contradictory, yet usually prescriptive or normative ideals that mediate mothering, end quote. It's also to do with the ways in which external forces, the mother's socio-cultural context and personal situation, interplay with her individual psyche. Parker also emphasises that cultural ambivalence to maternal ambivalence, even denial of its existence, is itself a factor, so that there's little place or space for women to express their difficulties. And this makes, and another quote from her, maternal ambivalence feel unmanageable to women by rendering them guilty for failing to achieve the ideal. Indeed, Parker makes a clear distinction, and again Lisa mentioned this morning, between managed and unmanaged maternal ambivalence. Or managed ambivalence can be positive and creative in motherhood, because it makes the mother reflect on her mothering and what is going on between her and her child. It's when a woman can't manage her ambivalence in this way, when guilt, anxiety and despair become such that she can't see a way to put things right, that, for Parker, she may become violent towards her children. So this work on maternal ambivalence provides insights into my reading of Olmi's novel and how it produces meaning. But first I want to consider the text as text, because what is this narrative? We know it's a novel based on a brief news story, written in the first person, a kind of monologue. But is the narrator protagonist speaking to anyone, or is the reader effectively placed in her head? Is it a confession? Does it constitute her legal evidence? Is it perhaps part of a therapy? There's absolutely no framing to the narrative, and so the context remains unknown. So we're just plunged straight in. And a mix of past and present tenses is used, imparting a sense that the events have taken place in a very recent past. It's told in a surprisingly coherent manner, I think, given the subject matter. The narrative is not obviously characterised by strategies of a subgenre called trauma fiction, as described by Anne Whitehead. I've given you my bibliography, by the way, there. So that's fiction that mimics trauma narratives and includes things like repetitions, ellipses, flashbacks, blank spaces, non-chronological narratives and screen memories to evoke the effects of trauma. Here, the action itself unfolds chronologically, although there are detours, divergences and memories and other voices which are mediated by the narrator break into that chronology in order to flesh out some background to the novel's ending and the narrator's ultimate murder of her two sons by suffocation. The narrator is nameless, the action timeless, albeit obviously fairly contemporary. It talks about mobile phones a lot. The place unidentifiable. We never learn how old the narrator is or much about her background at all. It's only clear that she's a single mother, that she doesn't work, lives in poverty, and that she suffers from some kinds of mental health problems. So how should we approach this novel, which culminates in child murder? I'd argue it's not actually a novel about infanticide, although that's clearly how it ends. Rather, it's more about exploring what can lead a mother to murder the children she has just taken out for a treat. It's about the effects of maternal ambivalence I've outlined. Guilt, shame, despair, the inability to cope, loneliness, the feeling of not being listened to, of not measuring up to social expectations. Also portrays the fragile mental state of a desperate mother, struggling against her own demons, including the fear of her children growing up and away from her. Though the narrative voice is paramount to the reader's understanding of and insight into the narrator's state of mind and to what happens. However, she doesn't articulate her state of mind as such, rather it is revealed during the course of her monologue, and the reader has to piece it together. The colloquial spoken register of the narrative is enhanced by imagery, and it's this aspect of the narrative that really brings out the narrator's state of mind. It is a common literary technique for the environment to reflect a character's mood, and Olmi uses it liberally here. So the vocabulary of the dull, cold, rainy and windy weather, muddy streets and shoes, soaked in freezing clothes which never dry out, saturates the narrative. The word rain or related vocabulary such as damp, soaked, puddles, flooded and mud appears on almost every page. The landscape reinforces the sense of foreboding that permeates the narrative and reflects the disillusion and mental state of the mother. but it also symbolises the hostile social environment that the narrator struggles against. What should be places of shelter, the hotel and cafe, are equally uncomfortable. The damp and cold of the town invades the cheap hotel where the family stay. Everything inside is brown like the muddy streets outside. The small dark room with no view is cold. The sheets on the bed are old, with patches and holes. The toilets are smelly, and the stairs to the room on the 6th floor is narrow, dark and steep, experienced by the narrator as pure torture and a punishment. So here the effort of climbing them thus reflects not only her exhausted mentality and the struggle that her life represents, but also a pervasive sense of guilt for which the stairs are her punishment. The narrative exudes her anxiety. Her stomach is in knots. She feels sick, her head spins and she's disorientated. She feels abandoned and dumped. She's overwhelmed and suffers from nightmares, hallucinations, panic attacks, and she hears voices in her head. So the environment that the narrator struggles against includes other people whom she perceives as a threat. She feels constantly judged and judges herself adversely, from the bus passengers to the shopkeeper, and from the cafe proprietor who belittles her hard-saved coins to the other mothers whom she frequently compares herself to, and especially in the eyes of the social experts who police her, her social worker, her psychiatrist, doctor, her son's school teacher. She feels a failure as a mother and as an individual. She protests nonetheless that she's a good enough mother and can look after her children, even if she does things in her own way. But other people's responses clearly undermine her confidence, and she struggles against a sense of shame that she doesn't measure up. The professionals should constitute a support network to this mother, but she doesn't experience them as such. Here, Parker's point about social and cultural ambivalence, about maternal ambivalence, is pertinent. The mother doesn't seem to be able to express her despair to those who can help, or perhaps no one allows her the space to do so. Ambivalence, of course, defines and is defined by contradiction. And one of the central motifs of Olmi's novel, the sea, encapsulates this. In French literature, the sea is traditionally associated with the mother. The words in French are homonyms, so mère, M-E-R, is sea, and mère, M-E accent R-E, is mother. Olmi's narrator wants her sons to see the sea, or at least an idealised version of it. Says, quote, "Tomorrow we'd be walking barefoot in the sand. We'd dip our feet in the water and laugh." End quote. But when they find it, quote, "The sea had lost all its colour. It wasn't blue at all. It looked like a torrent of mud. It was the same colour as the sky. What I mean is even the beach was like the hotel. Same feeling of being in a cardboard box. It's completely blue, really, I told Kevin." End quote. So the sea they discover is the antithesis of what the narrator had imagined and wanted her sons to see. Thus it reinforces the woman's general sense of disillusion and failure, reflecting her self-image. And it's also assimilated to the hostile environment which she can't escape. Yet despite the boy's fear and disappointment, the stormy sea fascinates her. Quote, "I wanted to be like it, self-contained, not giving a stuff about anything and taking up as much space as I liked." Even if the English translation loses much of the language play between sea and mother that exists in French, here the sea is clearly associated with the woman herself and with her aspirations. I'd say also make a point that the French title Bord de Mer also has connotations that the English title Beside the Sea lacks, which are to do with borders and limits and of being débordé in French, which is overburdened and overflowing. So just focus just briefly on the episode on the beach, which you've hopefully read. The eldest boy, Stan's reaction is troubling here, running off on his own on the shabby, rubbish-strewn shore, careering about madly as if trying to escape from something unseen, stopping short as if something's blocking his path and rushing off again. And when his mother tries to stop him, he hits her for the first time ever. She's clearly shocked and doesn't know how to deal with it. Now, on the one hand, as my colleague Natalie Morello, who's written about this novel, says, this episode represents the son's struggle for separation and the mother's inability to accept his individuation. On the other hand, I think it also signifies the son's confrontation with the destructive power of and the void within his mother, and here associated with the sea, we just heard with that quote. And his behaviour suggests he's frantically attempting to erect the barriers that she's sweeping away. The mother's inability to conceive of separation from her children is at the heart of the narrative, and the tension between protection and possession at the centre of her inability to manage her ambivalence. So there's more than a sense that the murder of her sons is premeditated. The narrator never expresses her intention in so many words, but page after page the narrative foreshadows the tragic outcome. For example, via the use of the conditional tense, later they'd have been ashamed, bound to be. And in comments which gradually become clear, such as, I couldn't wait to get it over with, we wouldn't be going back to the beach, I knew that, it's too late, I wanted to spare them all this, but it was going too fast for me. As you read them, the meaning's a bit ambiguous and they could relate to something else, but taken together, they drive the narrative relentlessly towards its awful conclusion. And that conclusion is surprisingly and somewhat disturbingly, I think, narrated with the utmost lucidity, the events lit by the pale light of the moon illuminating the hotel room for the first time. This combination of apparent narrative detachment with a fusional closeness makes the ending of the novel especially challenging. Overall, the mother's narrative seems to suggest that her motivation is protection, that she kills her sons in order to protect them from what for her is a world full of threats. First, the institutions that inspect, test and compare them to a whole range of norms. Second, the misogynist masculinity she presumes they will grow up to assume, like the men in the cafe, and which she feels unable to protect them against in life. Third, her son's own aggression that, quote, they'd kept in check and couldn't hold back anymore. Fourth, her own ability to cope. And fifth, poverty and the shame of not fitting in, so that ultimately, by ending their lives, she ensures that they are, this is her quote, never cold or ashamed again. And it seems as if she wants to spare them her own struggles to survive. As another quote, that's how I should have spent the rest of my days, in bed with my kids. We could have watched the world the way you watch telly, from a distance, without getting dirty, holding on to the remote. We'd have switched the world off as soon as it fucked up. End quote. Nonetheless, the underside of protection is the desire to possess, a need to control. And the narrator acts against seeing her son slipping away from her and being swallowed up by the world. Her inability to envisage their independence is interwoven into her narrative, with the emphatic and repeated idealised use of we and the three of us, and with descriptions of them holding hands. When Stan lashes out at her, she clearly fears his move towards individuation. This quote, there's the future, I thought, I didn't recognise my little boy. And she wants to keep him for herself, even to control his every thought. One sentence in particular makes her vision of fusion startlingly clear. Quote, I'd like to have been inside his head, right in the depths of him, so that no one else could take that space. My space, me, the first. I'm in him, on the inside, even if he doesn't know it. End quote. In seeing her children becoming independent from her, she fears the loss of her own identity as a mum. The scream on which the book ends, and which incidentally was incredibly powerfully performed in the recent theatre adaptation, was a reverse scream which drew everything in rather than letting it out. Says it all about the way the mother considers herself a failure, even in the one act that she takes control of. I think you've read it, but she smothers them in their bed, and her fantasy is that they'll meet in death, and the older one will carry on looking after the younger one. And when she looks at them, they're facing in opposite directions, and so she realises that they've gone in separate ways. They've gone their separate ways. So what can this novel, Beside the Sea, offer debates about motherhood? Psychologist Barbara Armand uses literary narratives to strengthen her clinical case studies of maternal ambivalence, because she states, quote, some literary works convey painful feelings and situations so vividly and imaginatively that they say to the reader what many patients cannot. End quote. Olmi's novel is part of a new body of work in contemporary French women's writing, in which mothers are the narrative subjects. Well, formerly, in French literature at any rate, and I think this is quite wide, mothers and motherhood had on the whole been represented and or narrated from the point of view of others. So maybe daughters, maybe sons, maybe other people. Just as Olmi's mother experiences herself as object of others' perceptions of her, mothers in literature have most frequently been portrayed as objects, not subjects of discourse. And there's always exceptions, of course, I have to say. However, in France, this is beginning to change in quite a big, significant way. And a growing body of work, both autobiographical and fictional, is expressing and exploring the subjectivity of mothers from their own points of view. But in the case of Olmi's novel, what does this exploration of maternal subjectivity reveal? While professionals may arguably have the opportunity to gain insights into the mind of a mother who has murdered her children, the attitudes of lay people tend to be formed by the often sensationalised reports of the media, in which mothers who kill or harm their children are demonised without the greater context being revealed. Olmi's text works to resist this kind of judgment. It doesn't ask us to condone the mother's actions either, but rather, by offering an insight into the mind of this troubled mother, the reader is encouraged to start to understand what went wrong rather than to judge. But still, the narrative doesn't give us the full picture. We might be able to piece together our own interpretation of the events and some possible reasons for them, but the novel also confronts us with what we do not know, and thus reminds us that we are not in a position to judge. Could perhaps tempt us simply to blame her crime on mental illness, thus feeding into stereotypes of mothers who kill their children as necessarily mad. And part of me wonders whether this is ultimately a failing of that novel, or a weakness in that novel. Yet even here we're still, and I think she does carry it off, we're not provided with sufficient knowledge, but instead the picture's just made more complex, as we don't really know. Although the novel doesn't fit the classic characteristics of trauma fiction, it does explore and express the mother's subjectivity beyond what words say, or beyond what words can say. By using metaphor and literary imagery to reflect the hostile environment the mother is struggling with and the contradictions facing her, it evokes, reveals and shows, rather than it didactically or reductively explains. The novel confronts us with what society tries to deny, a mother who has killed her children. And we're invited to look again and to recognise despair and desperation, to think differently about what we may not at first be able to comprehend. In doing so, it contributes to the cultural awareness of maternal ambivalence, the lack of acknowledgement and understanding of it, and the dangers of continuing to obscure it from view. Thank you.